What is the job of a doctor? It is to cure illness, and in general is to solve all illness. Well, that's a wonderful goal. I don't think any individual doctor is thinking, oh my God, if I actually cured all of my patients, I'm not going to have a living.
Yeah, but it would be a heck of a lot easier and good for society.
It's like when you're driving on the expressway, the only way you can drive is you look at the horizon, right? It's a hypothetical point, 5-10 miles down the road. If you look straight in front of you in a car, you'd crash. And it's the same way with leadership. And clearly from what you're saying, the same with HR, which is you keep on working to perfect your team and your function. It's a hypothetical future that you're not going to reach, but you have to go aim for it. That's your point of becoming excellent.
This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast where we talk to HR innovators about all things people leadership. If you're looking for places to find about new ways to think about the world of work, this is the podcast for you. Please subscribe from your favorite podcast listening platform today and leave us a review. Rebel on, HR Rebels. Hello, Rebel HR listeners. Thank you for joining us this week. Really excited for the conversation. With us today, we have Robert Jordan. He is co-founder and head of the leadership at InterimExecs. Has a new book written with Olivia Wagner called Right Leader, Right Time. Discover your leadership style for a winning career and company. We're going to be talking all about leadership today. Really excited to get into the conversation. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much, Kyle. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm really excited for it. And we had a great conversation just before I hit record here. This is going to be a lot of fun to dig into. I do want to start off just to learn a little bit more about you and your background here, Robert. Tell us a little bit about your leadership journey and ultimately what led you to write a book about leadership.
I have your classic entrepreneur. I'm glad you named this Rebel HR. I have a classic entrepreneur background. Early in my career, I started the first magazine anywhere that covered online and internet. It sounds impressive because we predicted the internet beforehand, but the other way we describe it is any mistake you could make in business. I made it, including some wonderfully boneheaded HR moves, like hiring one of my best friends and not thinking, well, what happens if this goes wrong? I can tell you what happens is then for the rest of your life, there's a little cloud over that friendship. It's not the right person. But so I have background launching a bunch of companies, some that failed and some that did remarkably well. I've now been in 3 IPOs, and I developed a particular expertise for myself around helping investor groups reach an exit. A lot of entrepreneurs, they're really great on the front end, the idea, the vision, the passion. And if they haven't done it before, generally, they're not so good at figuring out exactly, if you're not going to go public, if you're not 1 in a million, what are you going to do to get a return for your investors? I got good at that. And over time, kind of fell into this job title of interim CEO. And when social networks came around, MySpace, Facebook, LinkedIn, we launched an organization that's now known as InterimExecs. And it has a team called RED Team. RED stands for Rapid Executive Deployment. And so organizations from around the world call us, and we are a matchmaker for project needs in the C-suite. If there's a need for a CEO, CFO, CIO, or a team to take on a special project.
Interesting. And I think that's going to be a perfect transition to what we're going to be talking about today, which is the distinct leadership styles and when they're appropriate to leverage. So let's keep going down that path of kind of the entrepreneur, because I can imagine that many entrepreneurs probably started their company because they just had a desire to build something or to create something, or they loved the customer, or they just had kind of an itch to scratch. But when you get to a point where, you have to exit or scale up or become more, quote, corporate, that's a pretty tough transition for for many folks. And I think many HR professionals, a lot of times we're kind of on the sidelines watching this and wondering, why are my leaders struggling right now? Or, all this change and, growth, maybe where, expectations are changing. Maybe we had an ownership structure change and now expectations from that ownership group are different. There's so much there. And from our seat, a lot of times we're trying to help lead through that. And a lot of times we are trying to figure out what's going on. How can we help our teams be successful? And when do we know when somebody is the right fit or when the role is right for this person? So before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about the distinct leadership styles that you have observed and that you cover in your book.
Sure. And before we dive in, Kyle, I do have to say I'd be hard pressed to think of a time where it is not more vital for HR folks to show leadership and where your leadership is needed. We could dive into anything which is related to those challenges, such as the Great Resignation. We are in a time of greater fluidity and mobility, and where voice among people who are coming into the workforce and not that many years in it is completely different from our parents or our grandparents' generation of what it is to work in a company. You look at so many hot button issues that HR now has to address or has to, at a minimum, be in a support role to the rest of the leadership team. I have in mind, not that I want to go there, but Disney employees launched a website around the CEO. The website, as many of your listeners, I'm sure, know, it's called Where is Bob Chapek? That never would have happened in a prior generation of business. A public kind of protest against your own CEO.
Yeah. It is a new day and age. There's a megaphone available for people. And the virality opportunity of frustration, right? And I think we've seen that, when you look at things like, kind of the trend of like woke CEOs, right? Like individuals who actually want their company to stand up for whatever their social views are. And that's, that's not anything that I ever learned in my PHR certification course.
No, none of us had.
What do we do with that?
There is some degree to which social awareness behooves all of us, I believe. And then there's a line beyond which it's like, how deeply is a corporation supposed to go?
Right.
So, when you see a major investor like BlackRock, and for years now, they have been advocating for some form of awareness, for example, on the environment. It's not acceptable anymore for a corporation. Never mind the law in terms of, say, pollution. There's a responsibility here, right? But how far is this going to go, in terms of political direction? Well, you and I can have an answer as managers in a business. The employees in the company could have a completely different idea of how far or not that is. But that's a challenge, and that is where the HR function, I think, becomes more and more vital and less of, it's just the administrative side of it.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, you're a great fit for the podcast because that's basically what we say every single show, I think, in one way, shape, or form. And so often, we are, first of all, we have to demonstrate self-leadership. So, we have to be leaders ourselves, but then we're also trying to coach other leaders on how to, appropriately respond to situations and, what kind of training and development do we need to put leaders through so that they can be prepared for some of the, the disruptive environment that we're in. And then probably most importantly, how do I pick the right leader to step into a department? And, it's funny because I I can give you more case studies than I would like to admit about individuals who have hired to go into leadership roles that looked great on paper and had every single letter behind their name that you would want them to have. But if they weren't the right fit, if it wasn't that right seat on the bus, so to speak, then it was an epic disaster, really. Or, it was just, it was something where there was always something off, right? We just never really got where we wanted to go. And I think everybody that's listening to this right now is probably shaking their head up and down going, yep, I've been there.
And compounding all of this is the remote nature of some of work. So for example, Kyle, you and your company, because you're actually manufacturing real things, there are people that have to show up. But for much of work in the world that where you could be remote makes the job of evaluating, hiring, recruiting, training even harder, because it's much harder to see body language. And if we're not going to physically be in contact every single day, the challenge is magnified.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not that the challenge is different, but it's harder. You can't be lazy anymore and, randomly bump into one of your direct reports who might be having a rough day at the water cooler and read their nonverbals and say, oh, is everything okay? Now you might be sitting on a Zoom screen and they're like, they've got a box of tissues and they're having the worst day of their life, but they're smiling and like acting in front of the screen for you. And unless you have that level of relationship, you'll never know. Right. And I think we're seeing some of that.
Well, you're touching on, in the book, and I know we're going to talk about this, Right Leader, Right Time. We identified these 4 distinct leadership styles. We also identified the 3 common elements among these extraordinary leaders. And one of those common elements, the way we put it, is no hiding. And it was a phrase that one of the leaders we interviewed for a prior book used. He talked about the difference between being at a big pharmaceutical company as opposed to when he had his own company and there were only a couple hundred employees. And at one point, when he was only in the smaller company, he said, you can't hide. He said, at a big company, you can hide. And these days, when it comes to everyone being remote, you can hide for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, take it from someone who used to work at a company with 300,000 that eventually got to a company with 1,300. That is true.
Yeah.
The smaller you go, the less dark corners there are to hide in. So you just got to be better. All right, so let's shift gears because I want to dig into these and I think it's really important that we put a label to some of these things, because leadership in and of itself, I think, is a term that can be very muddy. Right. It can mean a lot of different things. And so I think one of the things I love about your approach is that you've really kind of defined this into 4 distinct styles. So what are the 4 styles of leadership?
The 4 leadership styles are fixer, artist, builder, and strategist. And one of the things our research pointed out is that there is no more one size fits all. It's very interesting that there are other fields, there are other professions where this came around years ago. And yet when it comes to business leadership, this really still hasn't dawned on most businesses. So for example, in medicine, Kyle, if you had a problem with your foot, I'm going to say, Kyle, you really ought to go see a podiatrist. I am not going to say, I know this great heart surgeon. You really ought to see him for your foot. And this is so obvious to us now in the Western world. It is the same, for example, in law. If you've got this brilliant thing you want to go patent, do not go to a litigator. Go to a patent lawyer. Well, in leadership, in business and organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, we have this kind of transference going on that if someone does one thing well, we start thinking, well, they could do anything great. And it's just not true.
That's a great example. And I'm sure that, that heart surgeon probably did read something about the foot in anatomy class like 25 years ago, right? But probably not the right person for
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the recognition, this has gone on so long and healthcare has come so far. I mean, life expectancy in the Western world is so vastly higher that it's not even a given inside that profession that the heart surgeon will say, oh, no problem, let me take a look at your foot. Unless they're your friend, they're not going to do it. It's become that clear that expertise has a reason. Not true in leadership of organizations yet.
Absolutely. But I think it's really interesting to think about it in that terms. And to go back to what I had mentioned earlier, when you get muddy about what leadership is, it gets really hard to select the right leaders, and it gets really hard to diagnose, what might be going on. So I think the kind of the first question is for us who are sitting here and maybe we have teams of our own, or we are trying to influence others. How do we determine what our leadership style is?
It's a great question. I'm going to give you a couple different answers. One of them is that we have been working to develop a leadership style assessment. And because of these 4 styles, fixer, artist, builder, strategist, FABS, FABS for short, we are about to launch the FABS leadership assessment. It is free. It's going up onto a new website we've launched called rightleader.com. So one answer is we welcome everyone to go to rightleader.com and take the assessment and see if we can give you some insight into your style. Okay. The second thing is that I think for a lot of people, simply having the conversation with people that know them, or even just thinking about what it is that turns you on, is going to be revelatory. So if I gave you a quick description, the fixer is the leader who loves running into the burning building. And what we distinguish in terms of that ability is that once they've fixed one situation, they've put out one fire, one division, one client, one company, they will tend to gravitate to the next major challenge. And if they're given something that's too steady state, it's going to bore them beyond belief. Okay. Artist is the person who views the world as a canvas or as a piece of clay. There are standout examples whenever anybody thinks of Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, preeminent artist leader. But many of us are called to or compelled to feel like an artist leader if you're the person in the organization that you just can't not think up new ideas. It could be anything from messaging to product to service to design. Okay. Builder is the person who has market dominance on the brain. This is the person who thinks about taking a division, a team, a client from something at smaller state, generally below scale, and thinking of structure, system, process that will move to some kind of dominance, whether it's in a particular market. I was just in Boston. Boston has this incredible bakery downtown called Tate. They are dominant. They are the greatest pastries in Boston. I don't think they're ever coming to another city, but in Boston, they crush it. There's the heart of a builder in that local business. And the 4th strategy is strategist. And that leader operates at scale. That is the person who is incredibly comfortable beyond personal span of control. How do you move an organization forward when you're in the thousands or tens of thousands of employees? It's a completely different proposition from the person who is used to, say, managing 20 or 30 or 50 people.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, you know the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about that. And, in the context of human resources, a lot of times I'm thinking about this as when I'm going to market and I'm looking for a new hire, and so often we try to put together these these job descriptions that say everything without saying anything, right? Like, every last like 2 pages on this jobs. But, thinking about it in those terms, it's honestly, I think it's rare that we actually have the conversation about, what does this person need to do in the environment that they're in versus what tasks do they need to achieve, right? So is the department on fire? Get a fixer. Do we need to scale into the thousands and we want somebody that can manage that complexity? Okay, strategist it is, right? But so often we're stuck in just trying to find that perfect candidate as opposed to actually finding the right leader. It's really powerful. I think that's really interesting. So as you were kind of, researching this and through some of your experience, what led you to kind of realize that these distinct styles really make a difference? And then when can you tell when maybe there's a mismatch there?
It's a great question. So our research started through this company, InterimExecs. And at that organization, we had been approached by about 7,000 executives from 50 countries. And in interviewing those folks, what we discovered over time, we started ranking, scoring, screening. What we discovered was the vast majority of leaders are having careers that are just so-so, kind of mediocre, not awful, not necessarily great. And there was a commonality in those folks, which was tending to be too much of all things to all people. There was a kind of dilution going on in terms of taking on too many different roles as opposed to figuring out, as we call it in the book, highest and best use. What is the thing at which I'm completely energized, great? I can never pronounce this author's name, but he wrote the book Flow, writing about this flow experience you have when you're completely in the middle of what is your unique ability, as Dan Sullivan would say. So we saw all of this example of what was not optimal. In our experience with Red Team, we would have this ringside seat. We owned the client relationship. So we're talking to the board, we're talking to the owners, talking to senior managers while an engagement's going on. And we're saying, how's it going? Are you happy? Is this executive or team doing great? And we're turning around the executive or the team and we're saying, are you happy? Is this awesome? Is this organization the right fit for you? Whatever. And this pattern became so glaring, which is these 4 distinct styles between fixer, artist, builder, and strategist. It was like, this can't be an accident. Then on the one hand, you have this more undifferentiated mass of leaders who are playing more Swiss Army knife. I'll do anything. I can solve anything. As opposed to this much more limited group, what we called FABS leaders, who tended to reject more. They rejected more of what they felt was not their highest and best use. So we felt we had to write about that. That's what we were trying to get at.
Boy, I feel that. It's really interesting. And it lines up with, this is more anecdotal, but some of the research that's out there that's showing that like an HR generalist role is really potentially not the best use of somebody's talent, because it is, like you said, it's like that Swiss Army knife, but some people are good at certain things and some people are good at other things. And so it's like, if you look at all the like Myers-Briggs and PI and all these like personality assessments. Basically what they all say is there's a continuum of what people are good at, and they very rarely are they right down the middle, right? So why would you try to like force somebody to do everything across the continuum? Eventually you need to try to kind of find that right fit. And it sounds like this is kind of in that same theme. Am I on the right track here?
You're totally on the right track. And one of the organizational psychologists we interviewed for the book, he said, you have to be spiky. And what he meant by that was that if you were looking at a chart or a graph of you, Kyle, or me, or anyone else on your team, of these desired qualities, traits, skills, all of these things, you need to be spiky in a couple of them, not all of them. No human being is. And when you think of a team, and you could even think of this in terms of the HR team, what builds an accretive team is different spikiness. That what you are best at is not going to be the same thing that I'm best at. And that's going to help us to become a better team simply in terms of having that conversation to know each other better.
I love that. Spikiness. I'm going to remember that. I'm going to say, I'm going to tell my team, my next meeting, hey, I need you guys to be more spiky.
Exactly. Be more spiky, and we're going to be more accretive.
I love it.
The example of this, if you don't mind, and this is on the radical end, I think, for a lot of your listeners, but, we had the good fortune to interview one of Google's senior managers, and he had a team in the hundreds, which is big for a Google team. And he talked about their continuing drive to self-obsolesce themselves. It wasn't with the goal that they were working themselves out of a job at Google, but because Google's mission so much is that things that are done by hand can be automated, that teams were working very hard to figure out how to go do that. It in no way meant you don't have a job at Google when you get done with the project. You would move on to a new project. But it called for a degree of self-confidence and understanding and faith in the organization, the rest of your team, which is, we're going to do the best job we can here, and then we're going to move on to another challenge. It's really interesting thinking, even for organizations that are not wired like Google.
I love that. In fact, I would argue that should be every HR person's job. Our goal should be to be so bored at work because we've got our leaders where they need to be. Our employees know what they're doing. Everybody's trained. We don't have any turnover, so we don't have to hire. The only hiring we do is for growth. And we've automated every last administrative headache to the nth degree, so that all you have to do is, as a leader, is just hit approve or something. It's pie in the sky, but
it doesn't mean you're going to be fired.
Oh, heck no! I'll get promoted if I do that.
Right. Look, you go to your doctor. What is the job of a doctor? It is to cure illness, and in general is to solve all illness. Well, that's a wonderful goal. I don't think any individual doctor is thinking, oh my God, if I actually cured all of my patients, I'm not going to have a living.
Yeah. But it would be a heck of a lot easier and good for society.
Because from the HR point of view, I had not considered it, but in a way, it's like when you're driving on the expressway, the only way you can drive is you look at the horizon, right? It's a hypothetical point, 5-10 miles down the road. If you look straight in front of you in a car, you'd crash. And it's the same way with leadership. And clearly from what you're saying, the same with HR, which is you keep on working to perfect your team and your function. It's a hypothetical future that you're not going to reach, but you have to go aim for it. That's your point of becoming excellent.
Absolutely. And I think from my standpoint, and I think I probably fit into the artist category as I was like sitting here thinking about myself. Like from my standpoint, I'm just trying to make sure that people are confident enough in what they're doing that they can march that path without like going into that self-preservation mindset, right? Because we all know that's a quick way down the drain. Unfortunately, we don't have a 3-hour podcast, but I would encourage everybody to, if you want to dig in, we are just scratching the surface here, but the book again is Right Leader, Right Time. Discover your leadership style for a winning career and company. I think some really great content in here, and some things I guarantee you, if you took this fixer, artist, builder, strategist mindset into your next position that you hire for leadership, and you ask that question of your team, what do we need? I think you're going to have a better outcome, because you're going to get people aligned around what you actually need, as opposed to what do you need this person to do. And I think that's really important, really great insight, something I'm going to take away from this. With that being said, I want to shift gears. I want to go into the Rebel HR flash round. So question number 1, where does HR need to rebel?
I'll leave your listeners with a phrase, cross-pollinate. And that's how I want to see you all rebel, which is figure out your spikiness. And I'm sure a lot of people know it. And just start thinking about the people around you, which is what are they spiky at? Because that's where we want to support each other.
I'm with you. And I can guarantee you, if I had a bunch of people on my team that were just like me, it would be terrible. It'd be an absolutely terrible outcome. So I agree 100%. We wouldn't get anything done. We'd have a lot of ideas. It'd be super fun, but we'd all get fired. So, all right. Question number 2, who should we be listening to?
Well, I'm fans of for example, David Brooks wrote a book called Second Mountain. And First Mountain those are those things you do for power, status, money, fame, fortune, career. And Second Mountain is what do you do for meaning and significance and commitment? And commitment is a word that resonated for me so strongly that I've been talking with people about that. And it resonated as well, because in Right Leader, Right Time, this whole idea of highest and best use is around what are you committed to?
All right. Awesome. We'll have to check that out. I am not familiar. So that is a new one I will put on my list. Last question. How can our listeners connect with you and get their hands on this book?
That would be great. They could go to InterimExecs.com, or they could go to rightleader.com, which is where the FAB's leadership assessment is. And the book is available. Our distributor and publisher always want us not to just say Amazon. Of course, it's on Amazon. But it's on Target. It's at Target and Barnes and Noble and everywhere else you find business books.
Yeah, highly recommend it. Just a little bit of a teaser today. This is one of those conversations. I think we probably could have kept going for hours, but just really appreciate you putting the work out there. Just wonderful insight into leadership, and we will have all that information in our show notes as well. So open up your podcast player, click in there, and you'll be able to find access to all of Robert's content there. So, Robert, been absolute joy. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Kyle. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Take care. All right. That does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.